I sold your motorcycle to pay your sister's bills, my dad said while handing me a random envelope of cash like that settled anything. I counted none of it. I just called the registry, confirmed one detail, and 20 minutes later Dad went pale in the driveway. My name is Wyatt. I'm 29. I'm married to a woman named Nora who is smarter than me in every measurable category and who I am only now starting to listen to, which she would say is about 4 years overdue, and she'd be right. I work in HVAC installation, which means I spend most of my days in attics and crawl spaces and the inside of ductwork, which is a sentence that has never impressed anyone at a family dinner, and I've stopped trying to make it. Before I tell you about the envelopes, I need to tell you about a motorcycle. And before I tell you about the motorcycle, I need to tell you about my grandfather. Because the motorcycle is really about him, and what happened to the bike is really about what my family does to the things he left behind. My grandfather's name was Randall Holt. Everyone called him Randy except me. I called him Grandpa, and he called me Kid, until I was 23, and then he started calling me Wyatt, which he said was because I'd earned the full name, which sounds like a small thing unless you knew Randall, and then it's not small at all. He was a mechanic for 41 years. He had hands like baseball gloves that smelled like lava soap no matter how many times he washed them, and a voice that sounded like a truck starting on a cold morning. He kept menthol cough drops in his shirt pocket year-round, not because he had a cough, but because he liked the way they tasted, and the smell of menthol and motor oil is the smell of being loved correctly, and I will take that to my grave. When I was 18, Grandpa pulled a 1978 Honda CB750 out of a barn in West Virginia. He'd been tracking it for 2 years through classified ads and word of mouth and a network of guys his age who all knew where the old bikes were sleeping. He trailered it home and parked it in his garage and called me and said, "Kid, I found us a project. That us is the reason I'm typing this at midnight. We rebuilt that motorcycle over 2 summers. Every Saturday and Sunday, 9 a.m. to dark. His garage had a concrete floor with an oil stain in the center that had been there longer than I'd been alive, and a window on the east side that let in a rectangle of morning sun that moved across the floor as the day went on like a slow clock. It smelled like motor oil and WD-40 and the menthol from his shirt pocket and the AM radio. He kept on a metal shelf, played oldies and weather reports in alternating segments, and sometimes he'd sing along to the Temptations under his breath and miss every note and not care. We replaced the engine gaskets, which took 3 weekends because the first set was the wrong size, and Grandpa said a word I'd never heard him say before and then apologized to the bike like it was a person. Rebuilt the carburetor from a kit he ordered from a specialty shop in Pennsylvania that he and his brother Uncle Ray drove 4 hours round trip to pick up because Grandpa didn't trust shipping companies with precision parts, and because the drive gave them an excuse to stop at a barbecue place in Morgantown that they'd been going to since the 1980s. We relaced the wheels by hand, which is a process that looks simple and is not simple, and that Grandpa taught me with the patience of a man who understood that the lesson was the point, not the wheel. I bent 3 spokes before I got the tension right. He didn't fix them for me. He just said, "Again," and handed me a new one. Grandpa welded a custom exhaust in Uncle Ray's shop on a Sunday afternoon, while my grandmother Lois sat in a lawn chair in the driveway reading a magazine and telling him he was making too much noise. And he said, "Lois, I'm welding, not whispering." And she turned a page without looking up, and that was their whole marriage in one exchange, and I loved both of them for it. Grandpa had a way of holding a wrench. Thumb over the top, not wrapped around. He said it gave you more control. I hold wrenches the same way now without thinking about it. I didn't realize I'd picked it up until Nora pointed it out last year while I was fixing a faucet. She said, "You hold tools like an old man." I said, "I hold tools like my grandfather." She said, "That's what I said." And she kissed me on the forehead and went back to the living room, and I stood at the sink for a minute longer than I needed to. On the last day of the rebuild, after the engine turned over for the first time and the exhaust note filled the garage, and Grandpa stood there with his arms crossed and his eyes wet, and he said, "Listen to that, kid. That's what 2 summers sounds like." He did one more thing. He took a Dremel tool, removed the engine cover, and engraved 2 sets of initials on the inside of the panel. RH plus WH Randall and Wyatt. He put the cover back on and said, "Nobody will ever see that but us." And that's the point. The initials were hidden. Private. An audience of 2. 3 weeks before Grandpa died, we took one last ride. He was 74 and had no business on a motorcycle, and his doctor would have needed medical attention himself if he'd known, but Grandpa said, "I didn't rebuild that thing to look at it from a chair, Wyatt." We rode 40 minutes on back roads, the kind where the pavement cracks and the grass pushes through and the air smells like dirt and distance and nothing industrial. Grandpa rode behind me steady, his hands where they'd always been, like the bike was furniture he'd been sitting in his whole life. We pulled into a diner on Route 11 that he'd been going to since before I was born. The woman behind the counter said, "Randy, it's been a while." And he said, "Donna, it's been 3 weeks, but I appreciate the drama." He ordered the same thing he always ordered, a patty melt and a black coffee. No cream, no sugar, because Grandpa believed putting things in coffee was a character deficiency, and he held that position with the conviction of a man who would rather be wrong loudly than right quietly. We sat in a booth with cracked red vinyl seats that stuck to your arms in summer, and he put his hands flat on the table the way he did when he was about to say something he'd been thinking about, and he looked at me and said, "Wyatt, this bike is yours now. Take care of it the way we built it. Don't let anyone tell you it's just a machine. It's not a machine. It's 2 summers and everything I wanted to teach you about being patient with something that matters." He paid the bill, $14.80. Patty melt, black coffee, a Dr. Pepper for me, and a slice of coconut cream pie he ordered and ate 3 bites of and pushed toward me and said, "Finish that. My doctor says I shouldn't." I finished it because refusing Grandpa's pie felt like a crime. I kept the receipt. It's in my wallet right now. Has been for 4 years. The ink is fading, but I can still read it if I hold it at the right angle. Grandpa died 3 weeks later. Heart attack in his sleep. Quiet. The way he would have wanted, which is the one thing that went according to plan. The bike was mine. Title in my name. Grandpa put it there specifically, which I found out later was not an accident. But I'll get to that. Now I need to tell you about the other side of my family. The side that runs on cash and crisis and the word emergency, used so loosely it's lost its shape. My sister Shelby is 31. She has had 6 jobs in 4 years. The pattern is identical every time. She's great for 3 months, starts calling in during month 4, gets a write-up by month 5, quits before she's fired by month 6, and tells our dad Gene that she was mistreated, or the manager had it out for her, or the environment was toxic. Gene believes it every single time. I don't know if he actually believes it, or if believing it is easier than looking at the pattern, but the result is the same. Between jobs, Shelby lives on credit cards and Gene's wallet. She has been bailed out financially 7 times in 5 years. I know because I've watched each one happen from close enough to smell the smoke and far enough away to not get asked to carry the bucket. Except once when I did get asked and I said yes, because I was 25 and still thought saying yes to family was the same thing as being loyal. That $2,400 I lent her in 2021 is still outstanding. She's never mentioned it. I stopped mentioning it because mentioning it made me the problem somehow. The bailout history, credit card debt, $8,400 this time, but previously also $6,200 and $3,800 in separate cycles. A car repo that cost $3,200 to reverse. A broken lease that ate a $1,800 security deposit. A phone bill so overdue it went to collections, $1,400. A payday loan that spiraled into $2,600 of compounding misery. Total family cost over 5 years, over $22,000. None of it paid back. Not a dollar. Shelby's financial crises are not emergencies. They're a subscription service that the family keeps renewing. Here's the part that makes it uglier. Shelby pays $1,850 a month for an apartment she cannot afford. She signed the lease when she had her best job, the one that lasted 7 months, and she won't downsize because the apartment is in a neighborhood she posts about on social media. Her Instagram is curated like a museum. Exposed brick, oat milk lattes, subscription clothing boxes, $28 candles. The $8,400 in credit card debt that Gene sold my motorcycle to cover is mostly restaurants, a $340 per month clothing rental service, and delivery orders. Gene sold Grandpa's motorcycle to fund his daughter's feed. I don't know how to make that sentence make sense. I've tried. It just sits there being ugly. Envelope 1. Thursday afternoon. I come home from a job, dusty, knees sore from a crawl space that was 3 inches shorter than my body needed it to be. I stop at my parents' house to check on something in the garage. The motorcycle isn't there. There's a tarp draped over the empty space where it used to be, which I almost didn't lift because I had no reason to doubt that a tarp covering a motorcycle-shaped space contained a motorcycle. But the tarp was flat. No shape underneath it. Just concrete. I walked into the kitchen. Gene was at the table with a cup of coffee. He wasn't drinking. The kitchen smelled like the pot had been sitting on the burner too long. That scorched coffee smell that means someone made it hours ago and forgot about it, which is Gene's signature move. He looked like a man who'd been rehearsing a sentence for 12 days and still hadn't nailed the delivery. His hands were flat on the table, fingers spread, like he was bracing against something that hadn't arrived yet. He said, "Sit down, Wyatt." I didn't sit down. He said, "I sold your motorcycle." He paused, like the pause would soften it. "Your sister needed help. Her bills were out of control, and this was the only way I could think of to handle it fast." He reached behind him to the counter and picked up a white envelope, the kind you buy at Staples in a box of 50, and held it out to me. He said, "This should cover it. I know it's not ideal, but I handled it." Handled it. He used the word handled the way someone uses it when they've done something irreversible and want it to sound like project management instead of theft. I looked at the envelope. I looked at the empty table where his coffee was getting cold. I looked at the kitchen window behind him, which had a smudge on it in the shape of a handprint that had been there for months and that nobody had cleaned because nobody in this house cleans windows unless I do it. I didn't take the envelope. He set it on the table between us. I should tell you what I didn't do. I didn't count the money. I didn't yell. I didn't flip the table, which is what the version of me that lives in my chest wanted to do, the version that runs on heat instead of logic. I picked up my phone instead. I called the state vehicle registry. Gene watched me dial. He said, "Wyatt, you don't need to do that. It's handled." I didn't respond. The phone rang twice. A woman picked up. I gave her the plate number, which I know by memory because I've known it since I was 19 and Grandpa read it off the registration form and said, "Remember that, kid, that's your bike's social security number." The registry woman, whose name was Linda and who was eating something crunchy while she typed, which I found oddly calming because it meant at least one person in this phone call was having a normal day, pulled up the record. She said, "Transfer completed 12 days ago. New registered owner, Tri-County Motors, commercial dealership." She said some other things about paperwork status. I wasn't listening to those parts. I was listening to the first part. Tri-County Motors. A commercial dealership. Not a guy who'll take good care of it, which is what Gene told me when I asked who bought it. A shop that buys used bikes, strips custom parts, rebuilds to stock specifications, and resells. The motorcycle that Grandpa and I spent 2 summers rebuilding by hand was sold to a chop shop with a business license. Linda also told me the sale date. Not Thursday. Not this week. 12 days ago. Gene had been walking around for nearly 2 weeks knowing the bike was gone. I'd been to this house twice during those 12 days. Sunday dinner. And last Wednesday when I stopped by to check the oil level in Gene's car, because Gene doesn't check his own oil, because Gene has a son who does things like that for free. Both times the tarp was over the empty space. Both times I didn't lift it. I hung up. Gene was standing in the kitchen with his hands at his sides and his face doing something I'd never seen it do before, which was nothing. No expression. Just waiting. He knew what Linda told me. He could hear the conversation from 3 feet away. I said, "You sold it to a dealership." He said, "They offered cash on the spot." I said, "They strip bikes, Gene." He said, "I didn't know that." I said, "You sold a custom-built 1978 CB750 to a commercial lot for cash on the spot, and you didn't ask what they were going to do with it." He didn't answer. He picked up his coffee, put it down. The mug made a sound against the table, ceramic on wood. That was louder than it should have been because everything else was so quiet. I said, 12 days. He said, "I was going to tell you." I said, "You told me today because I found the tarp." He didn't answer that either. I said one more thing. I said it louder than I meant to and hotter than I planned, and it's the one sentence in this whole thing I haven't decided if I regret yet. I said, "Grandpa knew you'd do this." He told me. He put my name on the title because he knew his own son couldn't be trusted with anything he built. Gene's face changed. Not angry. Something underneath anger. Something that looked like a man hearing a truth that he'd been outrunning for decades, and the truth had finally closed the gap. I picked up the envelope. I did not open it. I walked out of the kitchen and out of the house, and I sat in my truck for about 15 minutes with the envelope on the passenger seat and my hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2, and I didn't drive anywhere. I just sat there. The truck smelled like duct sealant and the lunch I forgot to eat, and the envelope sat there sealed and white and full of money that was supposed to make a theft feel like a transaction. I drove home. I put the envelope on the kitchen counter. Nora saw it. She said, "What's that?" I said, "My dad sold Grandpa's motorcycle, and that's what he thinks it was worth." Nora looked at the envelope. She didn't touch it. She said, "How much?" I said, "I don't know. I didn't count it." She said, "Are you going to?" I said, "No." She said, "Good." She made dinner. I didn't eat much of it. The envelope stayed on the counter. It's still there. It's been there for months. Sealed. I have not opened it. I don't plan to. Over the next week, I found things. Not because I went looking. Because the things came to me the way things do when a family breaks something and the pieces scatter. I went to Grandpa's old toolbox, which I keep in my garage. I was looking for a 10mm socket because I'm always looking for a 10mm socket because they disappear into a dimension that only 10mm sockets know about. Behind the socket tray, tucked into a fold of the felt lining, I found a letter. Grandpa's handwriting, dated 2 months before he died. I had never seen it. He must have put it there knowing I'd find it eventually, because Grandpa understood me better than anyone in the family, including the fact that I would eventually be digging around in his toolbox looking for a socket and would find a folded piece of paper and would read it. The letter said, "Wyatt, the bike is yours. Not your father's. Not your sister's. Yours. If anyone tries to sell it, tell them Randall Holt said no." That should be enough, but if it isn't, the title is in your name for a reason. I didn't put your father's name on it because I know my son. I love him, but I know him. I read it twice. Standing in my garage under a fluorescent light that buzzes at a frequency that's been annoying me for 2 years, but that I'll probably never fix because now it sounds like Grandpa's garage, and I don't want to lose that. I folded the letter, put it back in the toolbox, sat on my workbench stool, and stayed there for a while. Nora came out eventually. She didn't ask. She just leaned against the doorframe and waited. Nora's paralegal colleague, a woman named Diane who wears reading glasses on a chain and has very specific opinions about punctuation, pulled Grandpa's will. There was a clause I'd never read. The motorcycle was bequeathed to me by name, and the clause stated, "This bequest is personal property and is not subject to sale, transfer, or encumbrance by any family member." Grandpa didn't just give me the bike. He legally fireproofed it. He built a wall around it in a legal document because he specifically knew, that someone in his family would try to take it. Jean climbed over the wall anyway. I also found the voicemail. Jean left it 12 days before the kitchen conversation, on the day he actually sold the bike. 2:14 p.m. "Hey Wyatt, stopped by the house. Needed to shift your bike to get to the lawnmower. No big deal, call me when you can." The registry showed the sale was completed at 1:47 p.m. Jean called 27 minutes after the sale to plant a cover story. The bike was already gone when he left that voicemail. The needed to shift it was fiction. The casual tone was performance. I saved the voicemail because deleting evidence felt like letting him rewrite the story. Jean had the spare key I gave him 3 years ago, in case you need to move it for the mower or whatever. He used that key to ride the bike to the dealership. He rode Grandpa's motorcycle, the one with our initials inside the engine, down a highway to a commercial lot and handed the key to a stranger. The title was in my old bedroom, in the desk drawer where I've kept important documents since high school. Jean knew where it was because he helped me file it there. He walked into my room, opened the drawer, took the title, signed my name on the transfer line. The signature doesn't match. The buyer either didn't check or didn't care. There's a rectangular ghost on the papers underneath where the title used to sit. Like an imprint. Like the drawer remembers what was taken even if the family pretends it wasn't. The family found out. Not because I told them. Because families are leaky buildings, and this one has never been weatherproof. My mom Patty knew. She knew before the sale. She told me herself, standing in the kitchen a week later, wiping a counter that was already clean, which is what Patty does when she's nervous. She said, "Your father told me he was going to do it. I said he should talk to you first. He said you'd say no." I said, "So you knew I'd say no and you let him do it?" She picked up the dish towel, folded it, unfolded it, folded it again. She said, "He said it was the only option, Wyatt." I said, The only option for Shelby's credit card bill was selling a dead man's motorcycle? She didn't answer. She put the towel on the counter and left the room. Patty's silence has never been neutrality. It's always been permission with plausible deniability. Shelby called me, not to apologize, to explain why I was wrong. She said, "It's just a motorcycle, Wyatt. I had real problems. You can buy another bike. I can't unruin my credit. Just a motorcycle." She said that about the bike her grandfather rebuilt with her brother over 2 summers in a garage that smelled like menthol and motor oil. She said it the way she says everything that costs someone else something. Casually, like the price is theoretical and the damage is someone else's math. I said, "Grandpa left you a truck, Shelby. You turned it into cash. He left me a bike. Dad turned it into cash. The difference is you chose to, and I didn't." She hung up. I stood in my kitchen holding the phone and looking at the envelope on the counter, and I thought about opening it just to see if the number inside was enough to make me feel less angry. It wasn't going to be. I put the phone down. Uncle Ray called. Grandpa's brother. 71 years old, 3 hours away, voiced like a man who's been yelling at engines his whole life and has the hearing loss to prove it. He was not sad. He was furious. He said, "Your grandfather and I spent 6 months finding that engine. We drove to Pennsylvania for the carburetor. He welded that exhaust in my shop on a Sunday while Lois sat in a lawn chair and told him to keep it down." His voice cracked once, and he pretended it was the phone connection, and I pretended to believe him. Then he said, "I'm sending you something." A week later, an envelope arrived from Uncle Ray. Not cash. Photos. Grandpa and me in the garage. Tools in hand. Grease on our faces. The bike between us, half built, wires exposed, the tank not yet painted. Grandma took the photos. I'd never seen them. In one of them, Grandpa is looking at the camera and smiling, and I'm looking at Grandpa and not smiling, just watching him work, and my face has an expression on it that I recognize because I've seen it on my own son's face when he watches me fix something. It's the expression of someone learning how to be a man by watching one. Envelope 2. Nora's colleague Diane drafted it. I added to it. The certified letter contained the registry transaction showing Tri-County Motors as buyer at $4,200. The bike's appraised market value at $13,500 with custom work. The will clause protecting the motorcycle from exactly this. A copy of the forged title signature next to my actual signature for comparison. The voicemail transcript with timestamps showing the cover story was planted 27 minutes after the sale, and a demand for full restitution at market value within 30 days. It also stated that if restitution wasn't made, I would file a police report for unauthorized sale of personal property, forgery of a title transfer document, and violation of a testamentary bequest. At the bottom, below all the typed legal language and the numbered exhibits and the dollar amounts and the deadlines, I handwrote one line. In my own handwriting. Grandpa's words from the letter in the toolbox. "I didn't put your father's name on the title because I know my son." I wrote it with a pen that was running low on ink, which made the letters thin in places, which made it look more like Grandpa's handwriting than mine, which I didn't plan, but which felt right in a way I can't explain. I also put 3 of Uncle Ray's photos in the envelope. Grandpa and me. The garage. The bike between us. No caption. No explanation. Just the pictures, tucked behind the legal documents, so that when Gene flipped through the pages of demands and numbers and deadlines, he'd arrive at his own father's face. Smiling. Holding a wrench. Building something with his grandson that his son sold for $4,200 to a dealership that was already pulling it apart. Gene opened the letter in the driveway. Certified mail, signature required. The mailman handed it to him directly. He was standing next to the spot where the tarp still covered the empty space. He read the legal section. He sat down on the porch step. He got to the will clause. He put his head in his hands. He got to the grandpa quote at the bottom, the handwritten line, and he stayed there. Head in hands. Patty came out and asked what was wrong. He handed her the letter. She read it. She went back inside, closed the door. Gene sat on the porch step for 45 minutes. A neighbor named Phil waved from across the street. Gene didn't wave back. I drove to Tri-County Motors on a Saturday. The bike was on the shop floor, partially disassembled. The custom exhaust, the one Grandpa welded in Uncle Ray's shop while Grandma told him to keep it down, was on a metal shelf with a price tag on it, $380. The tank had been sanded for repainting. The relaced wheels were off and tagged for resale. I asked the mechanic, a kid about 20 who had grease under his fingernails and a Slayer shirt that had been washed so many times the logo was just a suggestion, if I could see the engine cover. He pulled it, turned it over, and there they were. RH plus WH. Still carved in the metal. They hadn't gotten to it yet. The Dremel marks Grandpa made on the last day of the rebuild were still there, in a fluorescent-lit commercial shop, on a shelf next to parts from 6 other bikes that had been somebody else's summers. The mechanic said, "You know this bike?" I said, "I built it." He looked at the initials. He looked at me. He put the cover down on the workbench carefully, like he understood what he was holding. Because the title transfer was forged and never properly authorized, Nora's colleague Diane determined the sale was legally void. The motorcycle was still my property. I filed a report listing the bike as taken without authorization. Police contacted the dealership. Tri-County had to return what was left and pursue Gene for their $4,200. The system did what I didn't have to. It made the entire mess Gene's problem. He now owed the dealership their money back and owed me for the destroyed custom work. Gene scraped together the restitution over 6 weeks. He took a loan against his truck. He borrowed from Uncle Ray, who made him sit through a 40-minute phone call describing every bolt Grandpa installed, every hour they spent sourcing parts, every Saturday morning in that garage. Uncle Ray didn't yell. He just described, in detail, for 40 minutes. That was worse than yelling, and Gene knew it. Shelby got the bill too. Gene went to her and said, "You need to help pay for this. I sold his bike for your debt." Shelby said, "That was your decision, Dad." Gene said, "Your bills. Your debt." Shelby said, "I didn't ask you to sell it." Which is technically true and completely beside the point, and exactly the kind of sentence Shelby has been constructing her whole life to stand next to responsibility without touching it. They didn't speak for 3 weeks. When they started again, it was Shelby asking for $400 for a car repair. Some patterns have a heartbeat and you can't kill them. I bought the bike back from Tri-County for $5,000. They'd stripped $1,800 in custom parts and sold some of them already. The exhaust Grandpa welded is gone. Sold to someone in another state through an online listing for $380. $380 for a piece of metal that a 72-year-old man bent and shaped and welded while his wife read a magazine in a lawn chair and his brother held the clamp and the sparks landed on the garage floor in patterns that looked like small stars going out. I'll never get it back. But the engine cover was in a box they handed me, wrapped in shop towels that smelled like brake cleaner and someone else's work, and I carried it to my truck and set it on the passenger seat and drove home with it next to me the way you drive, with something fragile that you've almost lost and aren't going to let out of your sight again. Gene left me a voicemail 3 months later. 41 seconds. I know because I checked the duration before I listened to it, like the length would tell me what kind of message it was. He said, "I drove past Ray's shop today. I don't know why. I just sat in the car. Your grandfather would have hit me for what I did. He probably should." His voice was different than I'd ever heard it. Not the Gene voice. Something flatter. Quieter. Like a man who ran out of the version of himself that talks loud and was left with whatever's underneath. I listened to it in my garage, sitting on a stool next to the bike frame that's back on the lift now, the bare metal catching the fluorescent light. Oil on my hands. The radio playing something I wasn't hearing. I saved the voicemail. Didn't call back. Played it again 2 weeks later while sanding a bracket. Still didn't call back. My son is 8. Last weekend I taught him how to tighten a bicycle chain in the garage. Not on the motorcycle. On his bike. A red one with training wheels, he's almost ready to drop. He held the wrench wrong, and I adjusted his grip. Thumb over the top. The way Grandpa showed me. He didn't ask why. He just did it. Grandpa's toolbox was open on the bench. The letter was still inside, tucked behind the socket wrenches. The boy looked at the toolbox and said, "Whose tools are these?" I said, "Yours." "Eventually. Just don't let anyone sell them." He nodded like that was a normal thing to say and went back to tightening the chain. It's midnight. I'm in the garage. The bike is on the lift. Half rebuilt. A fabricator in Asheville is recreating Grandpa's exhaust design from Uncle Ray's photos. New gaskets going in next week. The frame is cleaned. The tank is waiting for paint. And the engine cover is sitting on the workbench. Cleaned. Polished. I pick it up sometimes and turn it over and look at the inside. RH plus WH. Still there. The Dremel lines Grandpa carved on a Saturday afternoon in 2017 when he said, Nobody will ever see that but us. And he was almost right. The initials are still there. Everything else has to be rebuilt. But the initials are still there. Anyway, that's the bike. That's Gene. That's the envelope I never opened, and the engine cover I'll never let go. Subscribe. More coming.